Ladies and gentlemen, in just 30 seconds, 3 men lay dead, and legends were born. This wasn't just a gunfight. It was a showdown that would echo through history. Welcome to Tombstone, 1881. The gunfight at the Corral didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of lawlessness, ambition, and cultural tension in one of the most volatile regions of the American frontier. The year was 1881, and the place was Tombstone, Arizona Territory, a boom town that had risen rapidly from the barren desert thanks to a major silver strike in the late 1870s. Within just a few years, Tombstone had grown from a handful of tents to a bustling town of over 7,000 people, complete with saloons, gambling halls, brothels, and a sense of chaotic prosperity. But prosperity brought problems. With wealth came crime. The town became a magnet for drifters, prospectors, and outlaws, many of whom operated under the loose code of the frontier, where justice was often dispensed at the end of a barrel. Law enforcement was weak, corruption was common, and political alliances blurred the line between lawman and lawbreaker. At the heart of this chaos stood two competing groups: the lawmen, represented by the Earp brothers and their friend Doc Holliday, and the Cowboys, a loosely organized group of ranchers, outlaws, and smugglers who were suspected of horse theft, stagecoach robberies, and cattle rustling. The territory itself was a land still transitioning into statehood, remote, rough, and largely untamed. There were few formal institutions, and lawmen were often left to enforce justice with little backup or structure. Federal support was minimal, and territorial sheriffs had to rely on their own reputations, alliances, and sometimes brute force to maintain order. In towns like Tombstone, the idea of justice was murky and ever-changing, shaped more by personal grudges and public perception than by official courts or legal codes. Against this backdrop, everyday life in Tombstone was tense and unpredictable. Gunfights were not uncommon, and disputes over land, money, and honor could turn deadly in an instant. The town's main street was a dusty arena of pride and power, where every stare could spark a conflict, and every handshake might hide a threat. The stage was set for a dramatic clash that would become one of the most iconic events in Western history. At the heart of the gunfight at the Corral were two opposing factions, each made up of men who were larger than life, driven by pride, loyalty, and a deep belief in their own version of justice. These weren't just nameless gunmen or faceless criminals. They were real individuals with reputations, ambitions, and deep personal ties to the land and the lawlessness that defined Tombstone. On one side stood the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, men who had come to Tombstone looking for opportunity and order. Wyatt Earp, often the most famous of the trio, had already built a name for himself as a lawman in Dodge City and Wichita, places that were no strangers to violence. Tall, stern, and composed under pressure, Wyatt was known for his calm demeanor and his unwavering sense of duty. Yet, he wasn't a sheriff in Tombstone, not officially. That title belonged to his older brother Virgil, who had been appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal and City Marshal of Tombstone. Virgil Earp was a steady hand, a veteran of the Civil War, and a man determined to uphold federal law in a town where law often bent to the will of outlaws. Their younger brother, Morgan Earp, shared their dedication to law enforcement, though he was less experienced and more eager to prove himself. Together, the three brothers formed a tight, determined front, backed by a fourth and equally legendary figure, Doc Holliday. John Henry Doc Holliday was an unlikely ally. A former dentist from Georgia turned gambler and gunfighter, Holliday was known as much for his lethal aim as for his deadly case of tuberculosis. He was pale, sickly, and often drunk, but fiercely loyal to Wyatt Earp, whom he had befriended years earlier. Despite his frail health, Doc had a reputation for being fearless and volatile. He was quick to anger, quicker to draw, and dangerous in close quarters. His presence added a volatile edge to the Earp faction, an edge that would become crucial during the showdown at the Corral. Opposing them were the so-called Cowboys, a loosely knit group of outlaws and ranchers led by the Clanton and McLaury families. Ike and Billy Clanton, along with Frank and Tom McLaury, had deep roots in the surrounding Arizona territory. They were known for their cattle ranching operations, but their names were also whispered in connection with criminal activity, particularly cattle rustling, horse theft, and even stagecoach robberies. The Cowboys operated under a different code, one shaped by frontier survival and personal vendettas. Clanton, the most vocal of the group, was hot-headed and impulsive, often mouthing off in saloons and threatening the Earps with violence. Unlike his brother Billy, Ike wasn't known for bravery, but rather for stirring conflict and then backing down when it came time to fight. Frank and Tom McLaury, on the other hand, were more serious and dangerous men. Both were suspected of criminal activity, and both held a growing grudge against the Earp brothers, who had arrested or threatened their associates on more than one occasion. These men weren't just gangs of criminals and lawmen. They were part of a deeper social and political struggle in the Arizona territory. The Earps represented a push for law, order, and business interests tied to the growing influence of mining companies and Republican politics. The Cowboys, on the other hand, represented resistance, rural, Democratic-leaning ranchers who believed the law was being used to suppress their way of life. With egos inflamed, reputations on the line, and decades of frontier rivalry boiling over, both groups seemed destined for conflict. Each man brought his own set of skills, motivations, and grudges to that narrow alley behind the OK Corral, and none of them would leave unchanged. The gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was the climax of a long-simmering conflict, a deeply personal and political struggle that had been unfolding for months between the Earp brothers and the Cowboys. Tombstone, despite its silver wealth and rapid growth, was a town constantly teetering between civilization and chaos. Lawmen were trying to establish order, but they were up against powerful forces, outlaw culture, weak territorial oversight, and a cowboy network that operated under its own set of rules. At the center of this growing hostility were allegations of criminal behavior, accusations that the Cowboys were engaged in organized theft, smuggling, and even murder. Stagecoach robberies were becoming common in the region, with several pointing fingers at Cowboy associates. In one notable case, a stage was ambushed, and a driver and passenger were killed. The Earps believed the attackers were connected to the Cowboys, and Virgil Earp, as a deputy U.S. Marshal, began increasing pressure on the group. Arrests were made. Weapons were confiscated. The Cowboys, in turn, accused the Earps of abuse of power and targeting them without proof. This wasn't just a law enforcement matter. It was a power struggle, with both sides digging in. The Cowboys viewed the Earps as outsiders and enforcers of a corrupt justice system that favored businessmen and Eastern money. Many of the local ranchers and rural settlers sympathized with the Cowboys, seeing them not as criminals, but as men defending their livelihoods against government overreach. Meanwhile, the Earp brothers saw themselves as the last line of defense against growing lawlessness, determined to bring order and legal authority to a town being slowly overrun by intimidation and gunfire. The tension escalated with every encounter. Threats were exchanged in saloons and across dusty streets. Fistfights broke out. Political alliances were tested. One particularly volatile incident involved Ike Clanton, who repeatedly threatened the lives of the Earps and Doc Holliday in public. On October 25, 1881, just one day before the infamous gunfight, Ike had been drinking heavily and walking through Tombstone with a pistol, loudly declaring his intention to kill the Earps. Virgil Earp disarmed and arrested him, but the damage was done. The next morning, the Clantons and McLaurys returned to town, armed and angry. By this point, the conflict had passed the point of no return. It was no longer about individual grudges or petty disputes. It had become a battle for control of the town itself. The lawmen, acting under official orders, were now preparing to confront a group they viewed as a serious threat to public safety. The Cowboys, humiliated and furious, believed they were being hunted, not policed. Both sides had reached a breaking point. And in the center of Tombstone, beneath the clear Arizona sky, everything was about to explode. The gunfight that would become known as the gunfight at the OK Corral didn't actually take place inside the corral itself. Instead, it occurred in a narrow, vacant lot beside C.S. Fly's photography studio, just a short distance away from the back of the OK Corral. But geography is only a small part of the story. What truly matters is how those brief, furious moments on October 26, 1881, came to define the mythos of the American West. It was around 3 p.m. when the Earp brothers, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, along with Doc Holliday, began walking down Fremont Street toward the group of cowboys who had been spotted gathering near the OK Corral. Virgil, as Tombstone city marshal and a deputy U.S. marshal, was carrying a shotgun hidden under his coat. Wyatt and Morgan had 6 shooters holstered at their sides, and Doc carried a revolver and a hidden shotgun as well. The group moved with deliberate steps, not rushing, but clearly intent on confrontation. At the other end of the alley, standing near the rear entrance of the corral, were Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McLaury, and Billy Claiborne. Though Claiborne would flee the scene before the first shot was fired. The cowboys were partially armed, some having defied the town ordinance that prohibited carrying weapons inside city limits. Tension gripped the street as curious townspeople watched from windows and doorways. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Eyewitnesses would later say that no one could hear exactly who spoke first, but what followed was an eruption of violence that lasted less than 30 seconds and changed the lives of everyone involved. Over 30 rounds were fired in that half-minute, a blur of smoke, shouting, and gunfire echoing off the wooden buildings. Virgil Earp claimed he shouted, "Throw up your hands, I want your guns," as the lawmen approached, but whether the cowboys complied or went for their weapons is still debated. Some say Doc Holliday fired the first shot, a blast from his shotgun that struck Tom McLaury in the chest. Others insist it was Billy Clanton or Frank McLaury who drew first, prompting a split-second reaction from the Earps. In that instant, words became bullets. Gunpowder filled the air. Horses bucked and galloped away in panic. People screamed and ran for cover. Virgil Earp was struck in the leg by a bullet. Morgan Earp took a round across the back that grazed his shoulder. Doc Holliday, coughing from both his illness and the smoke, kept firing relentlessly. Wyatt Earp, incredibly, emerged without a scratch, a fact that only added to his growing legend. When the smoke cleared, Tom McLaury, Frank McLaury, and Billy Clanton lay dead or dying in the dirt. Tom had tried to run but collapsed after being shot in the chest. Frank fought to the end, even as he staggered, wounded and bleeding. Billy Clanton, barely 20, cried out for more ammunition as he bled to death. Ike Clanton, unarmed and terrified, had fled the scene as soon as the shooting started, his threats from the previous day now replaced with silence and fear. The entire confrontation had lasted mere seconds. But in that flash of violence, reputations were cemented, grudges were sealed, and a town that had already been simmering with tension found itself staring into the ashes of a fresh fire. Tombstone, and the rest of America, would never forget what had just happened. The dust had barely settled when Tombstone was thrown into chaos. The gunfight at the OK Corral was over in less than a minute, but its consequences rippled for months, tearing apart alliances, staining reputations, and plunging the town into a bitter and violent chapter that would rival the shootout itself in drama and consequence. Almost immediately, public opinion in Tombstone fractured. For some, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday were heroes, lawmen who had stood up to a dangerous gang, upholding justice in the face of lawlessness. But others, especially those sympathetic to the Cowboys, saw them as executioners who had coldly gunned down young ranchers in broad daylight. The deaths of Billy Clanton and Tom and Frank McLaury struck a nerve with the local community. Their funerals were massive, attended by hundreds, and served as a dramatic public mourning that seemed to cast them more as victims than outlaws. Legal repercussions followed quickly. Within days, the Earps and Doc Holliday were arrested and charged with murder. The case went before Judge Wells Spicer, and the courtroom drama that ensued became a spectacle in itself. The preliminary hearing lasted for weeks, pulling in dozens of witnesses, each with conflicting accounts of what had happened in those deadly 30 seconds. Every detail of the shootout was scrutinized: who fired first, who had been armed, who had followed the law, and who had violated it. The Earps maintained that they had acted lawfully, enforcing a weapons ordinance and trying to disarm known threats to public safety. Doc Holliday, always polarizing, was painted by the opposition as a drunken killer, eager for bloodshed. But as the testimony unfolded, Judge Spicer ultimately dismissed the charges, ruling that the lawmen had acted within their duties and that there was not enough evidence to prove they had committed murder. But legal vindication did not bring peace. In fact, the courtroom victory only deepened the divisions within Tombstone. The Cowboys, humiliated and angry, began plotting revenge. Suspicion lingered like smoke. There were whispers of conspiracy, accusations of corruption, and an unspoken awareness that the town was now living on borrowed time. The Earp brothers knew it. Holliday knew it. And the Cowboys were not the kind to forgive or forget. The violence didn't end in the courtroom. Instead, it morphed into a deadly cycle of retribution. Morgan Earp would soon fall victim to it, gunned down in a saloon while playing billiards just months later. Virgil Earp, already wounded in the leg during the Corral gunfight, was ambushed and maimed, permanently losing the use of his arm. These attacks were calculated and cowardly, carried out under cover of night, with assassins vanishing into the desert before lawmen could respond. Tombstone was no longer a town on the edge of the frontier. It had become a battlefield, a place where justice and vengeance were nearly indistinguishable. The once booming silver town began to feel the weight of fear and mistrust, and the Earps, once defenders of order, now found themselves locked in a personal war with no end in sight. After the dust of the Corral had cleared and the courts had rendered their decision, one might have expected peace to return to Tombstone. But what followed instead was a descent into personal vengeance, a blood-soaked journey that would redefine Wyatt Earp, not as a lawman, but as a relentless avenger. The seeds of the Vendetta ride were planted with the cowardly ambush of Virgil Earp in December 1881. Struck by shotgun fire as he crossed a Tombstone street, Virgil was left permanently disabled. Then, just 3 months later, on March 18, 1882, Wyatt's younger brother Morgan Earp was assassinated in cold blood while playing billiards. A bullet tore through his back, shattering his spine and exiting through his stomach. He died within minutes, bleeding out in Wyatt's arms. This wasn't just a murder. It was a message. The Cowboys had made it clear. The fight wasn't over, and they were coming for the Earps one by one. In the wake of Morgan's killing, something inside Wyatt Earp changed. The measured restraint he had once shown as a lawman gave way to a grim, unstoppable rage. No longer content to wait on the slow wheels of justice that had failed to protect his family, Wyatt decided to take matters into his own hands. He gathered a small posse of loyal men, including the ever-dangerous Doc Holliday, and set out on what would become known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. This was not an official law enforcement action. It was extrajudicial, personal, and driven by grief. Wyatt was deputized by the county sheriff, but the legality of his mission was murky at best. What was clear, however, was that he had a list, and he was determined to cross off every name. Their targets were those they believed responsible for the attacks on Virgil and Morgan, men like Frank Stillwell, Indian Charlie Cruz, and Curly Bill Brocious. The Vendetta posse rode across the Arizona wilderness, through deserts and mountains, in search of the men they held accountable. In Tucson, Frank Stillwell was the first to fall. He was found lying beside the train tracks, shot multiple times, with reports suggesting Wyatt had executed him at point-blank range. That killing sparked outrage among Cowboy sympathizers and the local press. But Wyatt didn't stop there. The posse continued their ride, their numbers shifting as they were joined by other allies and chased by lawmen who now saw them as fugitives. It was during this phase that the mythic image of Wyatt Earp began to take shape, not just as a survivor of a gunfight, but as a cold and calculated executioner. He was becoming a man shaped by the frontier itself, lawless, grim, and unflinching in the face of death. One of the most dramatic encounters came near Iron Springs, where Wyatt and his posse surprised a group of cowboys, including the infamous Curly Bill Brocious, a notorious outlaw and suspected ringleader of the anti-Earp attacks. In the chaotic gunfire that followed, Curly Bill was shot dead by Wyatt himself, reportedly with a single blast from a shotgun at close range. The story goes that Wyatt walked directly into the hail of gunfire without flinching, bullets whizzing past him, his coat riddled with holes, yet untouched. Whether legend or fact, the Vendetta Ride became a symbol of raw frontier justice, a blurring of the line between righteousness and revenge. Wyatt Earp was no longer just enforcing the law. He was writing his own version of it. Each kill, each chase, each dusty mile of that ride etched deeper into history the tale of a man who had lost everything and responded not with grief, but with lead. The gunfight at the Corral was over in less than a minute. but its echoes would reverberate for well over a century, growing louder with each retelling. What began as a violent confrontation in a dusty alley of a mining town became something far greater, a symbol of the American frontier, of justice and vengeance, of order clashing with chaos. The mythos that rose from that moment would elevate Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and even the Cowboys into legendary figures, their stories woven into the very fabric of the American West. In the years following the Vendetta ride, Wyatt Earp wandered the West, moving from boomtown to boomtown, Goldfield, Dodge City, Nome, San Francisco, forever chasing fortune and trying to outrun his past. He dabbled in mining, law enforcement, and even Hollywood, where he spent his later years quietly advising silent film cowboys on how real gunfights had gone down. Yet despite his many pursuits, nothing ever matched the drama of those few days in Tombstone. Until his death in 1929, he carried both the fame and the burden of what had happened on Fremont Street. Doc Holliday, the tubercular gambler and gunslinger whose loyalty to Wyatt became the stuff of legend, did not live long past the events in Tombstone. Ravaged by illness and exiled from most of polite society, he died in 1887 in a Glenwood Springs hotel room, far from the dusty shootouts that had defined his reputation. Still, his image, as the deadly, witty, whiskey-soaked killer who fought not for law, but for friendship, lived on in dime novels and whispered tales around saloon tables. As for the Cowboys, their defeat at the OK Corral and the subsequent Vendetta ride marked the beginning of their decline, both physically and symbolically. Though some survivors of the faction lived long past the 1880s, their names, Ike Clanton, Curly Bill, Johnny Ringo, were gradually absorbed into folklore as outlaws, rebels, or in some eyes, martyrs. The line between criminal and folk hero blurred, as it often did in the Old West. But it wasn't just the individuals who left a legacy, it was the moment itself. The OK Corral became more than a place, it became a metaphor. It stood for the kind of decisive showdown that Americans would come to idolize, where right meets wrong, where men settle scores not in courts, but in the dirt with six shooters. It became the model for countless Western films, books, and TV shows that idealized a rugged version of justice. Hollywood, particularly in the mid-20th century, turned the Tombstone gunfight into an enduring morality tale, casting it again and again with different actors, but the same iconic scene. Two groups facing off in a dusty street, the sun overhead, fingers twitching near the trigger. And yet, for all the glamour and gun smoke, the real story was more complex, marked by legal gray zones, political alliances, flawed men, and deadly misunderstandings. Historians have debated for decades, were the Earps true lawmen or ruthless vigilantes? Were the Cowboys common thugs or victims of a corrupt system? These questions have no definitive answers, only perspectives shaped by time and narrative. What cannot be denied is that the gunfight at the OK Corral, and everything it set into motion, became a defining chapter in America's Wild West mythology. It captured the nation's imagination not because it was the bloodiest or even the most consequential shootout, but because it distilled an entire era into one unforgettable scene. Smoke, gunfire, courage, fear, and the unrelenting march of fate. The dusty town of Tombstone, Arizona, would be forever stamped in the annals of history because of it. In the end, the gunfight at the OK Corral was more than just a 30-second exchange of bullets. It was a clash of ideals, of law versus lawlessness, of personal loyalty versus public duty. It was a moment where legends were born not through glory, but through blood, grit, and tragedy. Tombstone, once just another mining town on the edge of the American frontier, became immortal, a symbol of the chaos and courage that defined the Wild West. And though time has blurred the lines between hero and outlaw, between justice and vengeance, one thing remains clear. What happened on that dusty street in 1881 continues to haunt and fascinate us, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. The men who stood their ground that day became icons not for being flawless, but for being human, driven by pride, loyalty, fear, and the desperate hope that in a lawless land, they could make things right, even if just for a moment.